Very special thanks once again to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury. It's great to be working with them again, this time as you saw from the title for a Porsche Boxster. And of course I've reviewed a number of different types of car from them and their inventory is constantly changing. So if you're interested in something like a performance car, could be a super saloon or a sports car or a GT, then of course check out their current stock. It changes very regularly, so you never know what you're going to get. I would argue that the single most important question that a potential Porsche Boxster buyer should ask, at least if they haven't test driven one already, is how does it actually compare to a 911? Because of course a lot of people would call the Boxster, even to this day, the poor man's Porsche, or the poor man's 911. Is that actually true, and how does it compare directly to the one which I reviewed recently, a 996 Carrera? Well, actually, I would say yes and no. In some ways, it definitely is a poor man's Porsche, but it depends what you mean by the question. If you're looking just for the cheapest Porsche you can buy, well then chances are you're going to get a Cayenne, but it's not exactly a traditional Porsche. So if you're saying a poor man's Porsche in the traditional sports car sense of Porsche, well, yeah, actually, it is one of the most affordable options, and I wouldn't frame that as a bad thing. See, consider how this compares to that 911 which I reviewed. That is a lot of 911 for the money. You're looking at about 12 to 16 grand, depending on the condition of a Carrera like that. It's from the same kind of era as this one, and incidentally, this Boxster, the 986 shape, was the inception of the model. The concept came out in the early 90s, production started in 96, and in this first form, it ran until 2004. Now, they facelifted it in 2002. This is an 03, so it is one of those cars, and incidentally, it's only done 30,000 miles. And mileage when it comes to Boxsters is something that I'm going to come back to later on when we discuss the reliability and some of the issues that cars like this can sometimes have, so stick around for that. First of all though, let's get literal. Let's actually compare it to a 911. Not just for looks, which is the obvious thing, but in terms of performance, in terms of potentially even what it's like to use one, not just on paper numbers. Let's talk about those numbers as well though. Of course this does have a flat 6 engine, it's a 2.7 litre in the case of this car, so fairly small by sports car standards, and even the power and torque are quite low. This is not a Boxster S, for instance, or a club sport version of some kind like they would have these days. It's a 228 horsepower car with 192 pound-feet of torque. Those are not bank or brain-breaking numbers. They're pretty much hot hatch territory these days, and even 15 years ago, that would have been what you'd expect from a Ford Focus ST, not a Porsche. So does that mean it's slow? Because that would certainly be an interesting comparison to a 911, because they definitely aren't slow in manual or Tiptronic form. Well, no, it's not slow. In the case of this one that I'm driving, a manual, as you can see, it does 0 to 60 in a quoted 6.4 seconds. That's pretty much what you'd expect from a hot hatch, but again, that's certainly not bad for a sports car. The top speed though, which, let's be honest, you won't use that much, but it's still nice to be able to say the car can do it, is really impressive. This can do 160 miles an hour from that 228 horsepower, and that is definitely quicker than I thought it would be. Now for a 911 that would pretty much be expected, but for a Boxster, well that's pretty nice for the price point, because let's talk about that price. This one for instance is about 8 to 9,000. You can get a good one for anywhere between 6 and 10, and if you go lower than 5 you should start to question why, but in terms of buying a 911, well the closest you're going to get is the 996 that I mentioned, and you're looking at like at least 10 or 12 even for a bad one. More like 15, 16 for a good, and even a little bit higher if you're willing to go there. So on price, it definitely undercuts the 911. In terms of performance, well of course the 911 has an advantage there because it's a bigger, more powerful 300 horsepower engine in the case of the Carrera, but the performance on this one, I would say, for the price point of that kind of Porsche, is actually pretty good. It's a 160 mile an hour car, manual gearbox, mid-engine instead of rear, which is a huge difference between this and the 911. For those who don't know, the 911 of course is famous for having the engine behind the rear axle. The Boxster went a little bit more conventional, because of course a number of brands, even the Toyota MR2 or MGF, they have a mid-engine layout where the engine is in front of the rear axle, which loses some of that distinct handling which the 911 has, but at the same time it has two major benefits. It makes the weight distribution more even, which gives it more neutral, more forgiving steering, and also it helps to set it apart from the 911. And incidentally, speaking of setting it apart from the 911, one of the biggest complaints that 911 owners had at the time is that their 911 Carreras looked way too much like Boxsters, which when you've paid, 20, 30, 40 grand more, you can understand that complaint. It's a pretty fair complaint to have. In the case of the Boxster though, you could argue that that's a pretty cool thing. It looks like a 911, and that's not anything to be ashamed of, especially in the case of the facelift, such as this one, which in my opinion immediately makes it look better than the older model, which is just a little bit too soft and understated for my taste. Now of course you could go for something like a Boxster S, maybe even go for a newer Boxster if you wanted to. In the case of this one though, those are the specs that I was working with in this video. Now one of the really good things about the car is the weight, and that's not too surprising for a Porsche sports car. 911s tend to be good in that regard as well. This one weighs 1,275 kilos. That's really good. It's not overly heavy, it's got a decent amount of power, decent size engine, and the car itself is not small per se. It's certainly a lot bigger than something like an MGF, which, if you watch my review for that car, I basically look like Donkey Kong in a go-kart. However, that is to be tempered by saying that I'm not claiming that the Boxster is spacious. I was still pretty close to the roof in this one, as you can see. It wasn't exactly the most spacious thing I've been in, and I will definitely give the advantage to the 911 in terms of space. The headroom in the 911, the legroom, the width room, and even the fact that the 911 has two rear seats and the Boxster does not are significant advantages in the 911 side. And that brings me to the most important question that you need to ask as a potential buyer. You don't need to be asking, is this a poor man's 911? I think I've satisfactorily shown that it's different enough to be a unique car, but in some ways is, yes, a perfect entry point price-wise for Porsche sports car ownership. But the question that you need to ask is, what do you need the car to be? Because that is a much more important question. See, me for instance, I like my sports cars to be more on the GT side of things, something that's comfortable, bigger, good for long distances. A Jag XK for example. However, to bring the analogy of Jaguar full circle, if you're more of a sports car fan, well then an F-Type might be more your thing. In a similar way, your choice of Boxster or 911 really is down to what you want and need from the car. And this might be the most ironic and perhaps controversial thing I say in the whole video, but I would argue, based on my experience with this Boxster and multiple 911s, that in a funny kind of way, the Boxster is more of a pure sports car. See, the 911 is closer to being a GT than the Boxster is. So by definition, the Boxster is a pure sports car. It only has two seats, it's only a convertible before the Cayman came along, and that by definition just makes it more of a sports car. Smaller, lighter, two-seater. Now of course that's not to say that it's better per se, it just means that it's a different approach, and that ties into what I'm saying. See, if you need your Porsche to have the two extra seats, a little bit more headroom, legroom, a little bit more comfort potentially over longer distances, well then you might want to save up a few extra pennies and get a 911 instead. However, the price difference is still substantial, and that is something to bear in mind. If then you are just looking for a Porsche to keep in the garage most of the time, take out on a sunny day and just have fun in, well then of course the Boxster is the more attainable price point, and I would argue offers a purer, more straightforward, simplified approach to that exact kind of driving. In a way, that simple focus that the Boxster's purpose has kind of gives it its biggest advantage over the 911. There's no clutter to the Boxster's ideal. You know exactly what it is, and it does what it says on the tin. Now, speaking briefly to the practicality side of things, of course, as I said, it's a two-seater. Trunk space isn't going to be amazing, but chances are you're not going to care too much. Incidentally though, on this 2.7, the fuel economy is actually pretty good, and the tax is decent as well. Here in the UK, you're looking at about £330 a year. Fuel economy though is really good for what it is. It can do about 20 to the gallon around town, which doesn't sound great. It can do 40 on the highway though, and averages about 30 miles per gallon overall. Plus, with a 64-litre tank, the range is actually pretty nice for a sports car. Now though, let's talk about the reliability side of things, and even potential issues that you should look for if you are in the market. First of all, general reliability on any late 90s and early 2000s Porsche, at least from what I've heard and read from owners' experiences, tends to be actually fairly similar, mostly engine related. Early Cayennes, early Boxsters, and late 90s to early 2000s 996, 911s tend to all fall into a similar boat. The reliability isn't quite as good, even the build quality of Porsche at the time wasn't quite as good, and as I've discussed in other videos, part of that is because of their financial troubles. They were really trying to come up with new things, streamline the business, even trying to save money on manufacturing in some cases, and they actually had to retroactively fix, under warranties, etc., some of the original Boxsters. Now this facelifted one, you're probably going to see less of those issues because it is later in the production, and of course if you go for an updated Boxster, newer and newer, you're going to get better and better. In terms of the most common stuff though, well, oil seal failures tend to be a fairly common thing that if it's going to go wrong, will go wrong. It can be expensive. Porsche specialists of course could tell you if that is something that will need to be done. If you can check that before buying, then you should. And I would actually, on a slight side note, always recommend looking more so into a car's MOT history more than its service history. I've purchased a car, a Maserati in my case, with a full service history, every stamp in the book, and it broke down within 3 months. So I put very little credence into service histories. To me, the MOT history of a car is far more beneficial to look into, and there are websites that you can do it on for free, and it shows you all the failures, all the passes, and what the car's advisories were. And to be clear, buying a car that failed an MOT in the past is not a bad thing, especially if it was recent, as long as it wasn't you who had to pay to do it. Well, failing an MOT usually means that that part is fixed or replaced, and then the car passes the MOT when it's retaken. So in effect, the car is actually in slightly better condition than it could be. You don't really get that kind of insight in my experience from a service book, whereas an MOT history does. So look into that kind of stuff when it comes to any car really, but certainly in the case of this one. In terms of what you can expect in terms of mileage and age of the engine, age of the car, well, the engines on these ones tend to be good for anything between 100 and 150,000 miles. I'm sure there are some people who've gotten more, probably some people who've gotten less as well if they were driven really hard all the time, but that's the kind of window that you're looking at, which again for a sports car is pretty good, especially a 160 mile an hour one. And that's the kind of thing that you should be looking for. In other ways, it can fail its MOT for the kind of usual stuff, lights, tyre condition, and again, that can happen to pretty much any car. And incidentally, if you are or were a Boxster owner, for instance, of this generation, then by all means put your personal stories down below. It could benefit people who are watching the video and who are potentially in the market for one. Maybe something that I might have missed about the car in terms of reliability or common issues. And of course I don't own the car, so by definition I don't know every possible issue, and that's what you owners down below are for. With regard to those MOTs though, the Boxster of this generation has an official pass rate of 78%. And although that without context might not sound as good as you'd hoped, for a sports car that's actually pretty good. 78%, just under 8 out of 10 in other words, pass their test. For a sports car, that's a pretty good rate. Overall, I would say that it really depends on what you need from the car. If you're looking for a pure sports car experience with no thought to practicality, just the most affordable entry point into buying and owning a Porsche, driving it fast and having a lot of fun, then the Boxster is definitely the car for you over a 911. If though you want more of the long-term, more exclusive, more exotic Porsche experience with a full-on 911, but still for a more affordable price, then you might want to look more towards a 996. With, of course, those other advantages in having the 2 extra seats and significantly better headroom, etc., which you should also take into account. For a lot of people, the headroom probably won't be an issue, especially if you just drive it in summer and have the roof down all the time. Unlimited headroom. But those are my thoughts. Tell me yours down below, as I said. And of course, if you haven't checked out my other Porsche reviews, be sure to do so. I've covered a 993, 996, 997, and even a Panamera, of course. So be sure to check out those. And if you want to, you can click right here on screen to see them. But until next time, I'll see you then. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.